Those of you that know me well or have sort of been here, I don't know, some of you I think know I've been on this personal journey in the last year. So left the agency world, started a little boutique consultancy because I didn't have the idea, and my experience sort of doing ad tech startups was that I would save 2 years of my life if I just burnt the $40 million that my CEO raised, right? So I had decided that I wasn't going to do a startup again in our space until I had the idea, and that took me a little while, a little over 2 years. So last year I spent the year raising a little over $1 million in capital, building a company, and we're now sort of building a platform in this space, and we're still kind of in stealth mode. But a lot of this is sort of inspired by that journey, but also that I want to sort of talk to you about, but also just the genesis of the products. My first life was manufacturing finance, right? Which is a very big, I started out stamping, plating, and molding, and then I built consumer handsets, right? Sort of coming through that value chain. And my undergrad is in finance. I've spent a lot of time doing economics. That's very interesting to me. And I had this realization in the process of sort of, pitching and trying to tell a story that we're in the midst of an industrial revolution. If you look at it in a very academic sense, right? I've had this conversation with some of you, and anyone with whom I've raised capital or pitched our product has sort of heard this. But academically, an industrial revolution is about moving from sort of hand-tooled to automation. That's the elimination of the truck roll, isn't it? You can now buy linear television either, at a wireless carrier, or you can buy it in an end cap, right, through a set-top box that's connected to the internet. And some of the other things, are that the buyers start to use data and technology to buy more efficiently, right? And the reality is that also things typically happen like the mass production of goods, right, that lower the cost of units sold. And that's one of the challenges, the greatest business challenge we have, is that disproportionately the cost of distribution and sort of the cost of creation, they're moving in divergent ways, right? The cost of producing content has not decreased at the same rate that the diminishment in the cost of distribution has, and also sort of the migration of audiences to new platforms. So it leaves us with a big problem, right? And so we sort of address that problem with this idea of programmatic. And again, programmatic is just using data and technology to deliver greater ROI, or let's be honest, it's about doing more with less more often than not, right? And that so really is a symptom of an industrial revolution. And if we look at how programmatic has evolved through the different ecosystems of first display and search, right? And then social and video, and now television or the living room being the final battleground, we've seen the evolution always be that the sell side is the first to be served, right? So you go where the source of the money is, and that's the sell side. So the buy side platforms, the DSPs, there are more of them. Those that build marketplaces, many of you in the room, fundamentally have the same technology, which is you build transactional software and intellectual property. You find the point where the transaction occurs at the price, and you facilitate that. But the reality is the margins aren't that great in that because there's not a lot of volume in video, right? That's what we all found out. That was the ocean app we had when we saw the value of things like Freewheel's acquisition, right? We realized there's not a lot of volume there. It's liquidity constrained. So we serve that side, and why else? Because people always want to buy toilet paper cheaper, right? And when times are tough, that's what you do. You put price pressure down, and you try and sort of resource and procure cheaper. And the reality is that we found ourselves as a result of that, just a natural evolution of a marketplace that the buy side is served first, that whether or not we realize this, I have this construct in my head I sort of call little data, big data. We are focusing on what I call little data, okay? And so John and I were prepping, and he made a great statement, which is, I think is the truth, but we don't necessarily acknowledge it. We all talk about big data because, we're either trying to raise capital, or it's this big black box for which we are trying to create this sort of, mystery around to keep pricing perhaps artificially high. But we know how to handle big data, right? The reality is it's the disparate nature of the data, the lack of real time, there's latency, things like that, legacy infrastructure, digital, et cetera. That's the challenge of the data. It's not the volume of it. But when I say little data, I mean first party data, the data we use at the time of ad call that is about the individual, the granularity of data about getting to a person, right? So to me, big data is upstream. That's the point of distribution, the origin of content creation, right? That's sort of up there, and that's where the problems are. And so as a result of the natural maturation of the marketplace, because the buy side is served first, we're focusing on little data, whether or not we realize that. I think you can use any language you want to talk about it, but that's just kind of how I look at it, right? And we're chasing our tails because of that disparity in quality. because linear infrastructure has a time delay, right? How it works, it's not real time, it's on an impression level. We have real time data and transparency. It creates incongruency, like the inability to sort of really fluidly define an audience in digital, and yet we have impression level data. But so we define an audience up funnel for television, and what does that mean, and how do we marry that together, right? I make an analogy a lot to sort of one of my first areas of work, which is in telecoms. And I was in telco, I'm dating myself now, but I was in telco and we were going through the migration. I think I talked about this last year a little bit, from 2.5 to 3G networks, right? I think this is really relevant because what was happening is that, telco operators were making sort of decisions about, do they want to be owners of pipes because they were owning distribution, or do they want to be content owners? And content owners were that was a way sexier job, right? So when they were making the decisions for their network overlays, which is a complete displacement and replacement of infrastructure, right, of wireless infrastructure, 2.5 to 3G. It wasn't a migration, it was an overlay. Substantial capital investment. They were looking at an opportunity of net new revenue. Voice to data. Voice may or may not die off, but this whole new world of smartphones and data-connected devices and applications, and all of a sudden, the value of a mobile device, that was net new revenue. That was opportunity. If we liken that to where we are right now in our industry of media and of the battle of distribution versus content, we clearly know who owns content, right? We know that some folks in the distribution space are trying to play in the content space as well. Dish is doubling down, Direct is doubling down, they're making investments in content. But still, fundamentally, there is a lack of incentive of pure net new revenue in order to justify the investment in capital infrastructure to be able to ride the same caliber of real-time data that we get from digital in a legacy infrastructure construct or in a linear TV VOD, right? And I think that, when we don't have the economic incentive there, what is the incentive of broadcasters to overlay their ad infrastructure, their legacy ad infrastructure, to provide us what we want to make our little data the most valuable, because the big data is a congruent data set that we can marry to it, right? And so I think this is important because we need to eat our own dog food as the advertisers that are actually sort of, infusing revenue into that ecosystem. We're on the buy side. A lot of us here are. Some of us are trying to work on the sell side and serve publishers as well. But I think it's really important because we need to own the fact that we live in a freaking bubble, okay? And I say this because, look, last year we're $180 billion industry in 2014, right? That's total ad spend, digital and linear. Linear is about 74. We think it's going to be about 80 this year. It's a good chunk of change, right, to all hang our hat on. And that, in 2014, despite all the challenges in our business, was the highest growth year since 2004. But let's just have a bit of perspective, okay? Walmart's revenue in 2014 was $473 billion. They're the second largest company in the world. The first is a Chinese oil conglomerate. Shell's gross revenue was $477 billion. Okay, just perspective. So advertising, how important that is, content versus distribution. Let's just go back to my comment yesterday about Comcast. They're about $70 billion for 2014, and their free cash flow for Q3 of 2014 was $2.5 billion. Right? So their free cash flow on a quarterly basis is more than 10% of the total value of the entirety of the advertising industry in the US. I'd drop the mic right now and walk off if I had a Comcast business card, right? So I think it's really important. I think it's really important that, I guess what my perspective is not coming from media and not, going into buying an agency out of university and being a business person and doing really unsexy stuff. And still my favorite place in the world is on a manufacturing floor, making products, or talking to my dad about total quality management and DMing, right, over a beer. Like, for me, that's gratifying because it's tangible. And what I think is interesting is we have this opportunity that, even though we have soft goods, and I think we create an enigmatic sort of concentric circle around that. Like, it's advertising, it's like, it's feel, it's hearts and minds, it's brand equity and stuff like that. And so we perpetuate that because there is a short-term gain in doing so. By keeping the mystique around advertising, we have this opportunity to create an artificial, retain an artificial level of perceived value around it, right? And I guess what I'm suggesting to you is that there's an opportunity for us to look beyond the walls of media to solve our business problems. And that's the fundamental ethos I have in the product that I'm trying to build, is to look beyond the walls of media to build a platform that solves problems for broadcasters. you know, I may not be right, but damn if I'm not going to try, right? Because I got to tell you, I'm so much more interested in a $477 billion industry than I am in a like $20 billion one, right? So that being said, I think that, you know, we've lived in this hubris of our industry that we have defined our measures of success, right? You're likely to be successful if you define success yourself. So I think yesterday, you know, we were talking about this and sort of talking in circles, and I think we have an opportunity, because the reality is that us sitting in this room, we are defining the future of our industry. And I say that without hubris, but with humility. And I say that because so one of the things that I'm doing in my journey coming out of the new year, so like we closed in September, so like 90 days into it, I was just like, all right, how do I, you know, I got through all the minutia of a startup, and now I was like, now I want to build, I want to get dirty, I want to get in my product. And I started doing this, like, you know, self-help program, this like 14 days about how to set goals that are, you know, you can shorten the path from point A to point B, right? So very linear focused. And one of the sections is about, it's about the 6 human needs. And so this construct applies to business, it applies to whatever, and there's a lot of emotion in what we do, right? You have a contingent on the buy side that has been doing it and making a lot of money, and the analogy was made yesterday, you spend, you know, who said it? Dave said it. You spend how much money in one day, right? And you make $2.5 million in an afternoon, and then you get Super Bowl tickets and you get Emmy tickets, and like you're good to go for the next quarter, right? Whereas we're working. That's one area that's maybe a little bit scared that reality is going to change, right? They don't want sort of the wool over their eye to be removed. And then you've got another contingent that's like hungry and dog on bone, and that's sort of the digital side of the camp, and actually everybody else and their brother that's trying to get into the budgets of these guys. So, you know, that being said, there's those that need comforted and those that need, you know, you need to put some crumbs out in front of them. And the construct in my little self-help thing that I think is really analogous and came out yesterday, which is why maybe I attach these words to it, is the first human need that this person suggests that I'm listening to is we need certainty. And I can tell you as a single girl, that's like the worst part, right? So like, you know, whether it's in your life, your personal relationships, or in business, like we all need a bit of certainty around which we can hang our hats on. The second human need is uncertainty. Because we get bored. And if we're not challenged, if we're not, you know, if we're not sort of stimulated, then we lose interest, right? So that applies in love, that applies in life, that applies in work. And I would suggest to you that the contingency in this room is probably one that needs a little bit more uncertainty than the average bear, right? I would suggest that's the case. And maybe you compensate, you know, that in a different way with, you know, your personal life is more certain, et cetera. But I would say we all sort of, you know, we thrive in uncertainty. And in the reality is that, you know, I think we are probably trying to change the hearts and minds of stakeholders in our industry that are more comfortable with certainty. That's a big insight for us, right? So the fact that we use language that no one understands and we all mean something different, like programmatic. I think, you know, programmatic is like gluten. Nobody knows what the hell of it is, but everybody's scared of it and talks about it. As was engagement in digital media 5 years ago, right? I mean, like, it's just, we have these consistent patterns of repeating ourselves, and that's the perpetuation of this, what I call the enigmatic nature of advertising, you know, which is why Wanamaker said 50% of my advertising works, I just don't know which 50% of it is, right? So that hasn't really changed today. Like, we have these black boxes that we seem to sort of perpetuate, and I think if you look at what happens after an industrial revolution, if you look at the industrial revolution we had in the earliest part of this century, you know, many suggest we are in right now is the era of knowledge, which is a renaissance. So the reality is that if we choose to own our own destiny, and if you will, what I call take a very Cartesian approach to our manifest destiny, right? Free will, owning it. If we choose to do that, then we are on the cusp of a renaissance. And I guess what I'm suggesting to you is that we will only achieve that if we choose to embrace our destiny of being titans and artists of our industry. Right? And that is by looking to the titans of other industry and artists of other industry that have shaped real businesses that have sustainable, true economic value creation over a long period of time, right? So, you know, I think that's a big part of it. And I think that if we choose to embrace this sort of paradigm of creating real economic value, we can hang our hat on something that there's a greater good. And that's one of the other 6 needs, right? We need to feel like we're contributing and we're needed. And that's a big part of it. if we're part about shaping this industry and creating sustainable value, not just short-term gains, which sometimes is what we get caught up in when we are in a startup ecosystem of a 3 to 5 year exit at a 25x multiple, which is a risk we are posed by the infusion of capital into our space. You know, if we keep an eye on the prize, which is building an industry that is steadfast, I think that we will all be better served in a humanistic way. And I think at the end of the day, that's all that really matters. Because, you know, if we love what we do, we never work a day in our life. So, you know, I think also, I just maybe part of this is for me is I wear the word gratitude around my neck every day. It's a big part of, I think, my journey when I was raising capital. It was really hard, like being rejected every day, because my business pitch was not, you know, perhaps because, and I say in jest because I'm not a 29-year-old in a hoodie, and I'm a woman, you know, so I think if I went in, I was like, I'm gonna blow up television, I'd got to check much faster, right? But instead, my story was, boys and girls, this is a $74 billion industry. If I improve it by 200 basis points, that's 2%, and I capture 50 basis points, which is 0.5% of that, I've built you $1 billion business. It's not interesting. It's not 3 to 5 years. It's not exit. It's not a 10, 25x multiple, right? So we have to look to, I think, outside of ourselves, because we're not an industry of short-term games. Stuff doesn't change overnight in our industry, even though we'd like to think it does, right? So I think that this idea of gratitude for me is something that I hold on to, and I've really been reflective of yesterday, and I think I use that word and being blessed, because we are shaping our industry, and there's enough room for all of us. It's a nascent space. So I think that we have the burden of integrity. So things like the game of arbitrage and things like the black box of the data that we're building and everything. Like, again, let's look outside of ourselves to sort of set our standards, right? Arbitrage. I have no problem with it. If you're playing with the big boys and you're putting skin in the game, right? If you're putting capital and your liquidity on the table and you're writing a check in cash to own inventory, to actually make money on that spread like the financial markets do. If we're actually trading in a transparent market where the supply and demand curve meet, and an open transparent market is really the price point that the market bears, not what we have today, which are trading desks that have artificial price floors and ceilings and things like that. Like, that's the reality in which we live, and I think that if we look outside of ourselves, again, we have this opportunity to accelerate the business and create a destiny that has much sort of a longer, steadfast upside game. So that's my little shtick, and I think that a big part of it is that, you know, if we don't define our own dreams and make a decision to pursue them, the reality is that we're going to spend our career helping someone else fulfill their dreams. And so I think that if your ass is here and you're giving up a weekend because this is your industry and the business in which you're in, I would suggest that you love what you do. At least I hope you do. If you don't, figure it out. Work on that. I'll give you my 14-day set of tapes. Okay? Spend some QT together. Or just stop eating gluten, because then supposedly mental clarity will come. I feel blessed to be here. I feel blessed because all of you have made me smarter. And I hope that we can sort of take what we've nurtured this weekend and go beyond, you know, Fort Lauderdale on these walls and create sustainable value with one another as partners and as collaborators in this new economy and the renaissance that we're about to create together. So let's do this.